Hey guys, my name is Akash. So today we're talking about easement by prescription and by custom. With this, we'll complete the part of acquisition of easement. Here are all the previous videos on easement, what is servient and dominant heritage, acquisition of easement by grant, by necessity, quasi-easement and all that good stuff is here. So check that out if you feel like it. But now coming back to today's first topic, we have easement by prescription. So the concept is pretty simple. It says that if someone enjoys an easement right for 20 years, continuously and without any interruption, he acquires an absolute and enforceable right over that easement, which can be now enforced in a court of law. Section 15 of the Easements Act talk about this. Here it is. So easements like right to light and air, right to support, right to way, whatever it is, if someone enjoys those continuously and without any interruption for a period of 20 years, then he acquires an enforceable and absolute right over that easement. This was the easy part, the definition of section 15. What is easement by prescription? Now let's get into the explanations of these sections that sometimes seems a little bit problematic. You can find those explanations below the main section, that is the main definition in your Bare Act. So explanation 1 says that if the right is being enjoyed as a result of a contract between the dominant and the servient owner, and in that contract it is mentioned that such right is not granted as an easement, or if granted as an easement, it is granted as an easement for a limited period, then such a right can never be acquired by prescription. That is, that right never becomes absolute and enforceable at the end of 20 years, even if it was enjoyed continuously and without any interruption. So let's say you allow me to use your land to get into my house as an easement right for a limited period of 30 years. Now at the end of 30 years, after the expiration of this period, I cannot say that I have used this right without any interruption and continuously for a period of 20 years, for a period more than 20 years. So now I have an absolute and enforceable right over this easement, because this right was granted to me by a contract of an easement for limited period in the very first place. Okay, now moving on to explanation 2. Now this explanation explains what interruption means within the definition of this section, within the scope of this section. So according to this section, to be called an interruption, there should be an actual cessation or actual stoppage of the enjoyment of the easement right by someone other than the claimant himself. So if the claimant, that is the person who enjoys the right, he himself voluntarily stops using the right and then restarts using it after some time, that will not be regarded as an interruption. The interruption must come from someone other than the claimant himself. But just not that. An interruption, to be called an interruption under the scope of this section or under the definition of this section, the stoppage of enjoyment must extend for a minimum period of 1 year. If the period is not extended up to 1 year, the stoppage is for say 6 months or 7 months, whatever it is, then that period will not be regarded as an interruption. I am using my easement right to get into my house through your land, this time not by any contract. So before the expiration of 20 years, you stop me from using your land as my right to way. And I accept that. I don't put any objection or I don't try to reinforce my right within a period of 1 year. Now this will be considered as an interruption under the definition of this section. Now if I start using the right after say 1 year or 1.5 years, then at the end of 20 years, starting from the first day when I started using this right, not the period after interruption, from the first day when I started using this right, at the end of such 20-year period, I will not be able to enforce my right, my absolute right of easement of way over your land, because there has been an actual interruption in the middle and the period will now restart from the day I started using your land after such interruption. But suppose if I myself voluntarily stopped using that land for say 1 year or 1.5 years and then start reusing it after 1.5 years, then that will not be an interruption under this section, and at the end of 20 years I will gain an absolute enforceable right of easement of way over your land. Alright, now moving on to explanation number 3. It provides another scenario that cannot be considered as an interruption. So according to explanation 3, if the dominant and the servient owner gets into a contract as a result of which there is a temporary suspension of enjoyment of that right, then that temporary suspension for whatever period it is, that will not be considered as an interruption. Again, say you and I are related over an easement right, you being the dominant owner, I being the servient owner. The right is that of your drainage through my canal. Now, for some big say renovation purpose, I need my canal dry for a period of 1.5 years. So you and I get into a contract saying that you will not use that canal for 1.5 years, and after the renovation is complete, we both will start reusing that canal. So according to this explanation, at the end of 20 years, this suspension for 1.5 years will not be regarded as an interruption that will make you ineligible for claiming an absolute and enforceable easement right of drainage through my canal, because the suspension was a result of a contract between you and me, that is the dominant owner and the servient owner. Now the last explanation of this section, explanation number 4. So explanation 4 is the easiest of the bunch. It says that in case of an easement right to pollute water, and yes, that is a legitimate kind of easement where the dominant owner is allowed to pollute the water body of the servient owner, water body owned by the servient owner. So in such a case, the period of 20 years will run from the day when the pollution noticeably disturbs the dominant owner, and not from the day when the pollution actually began. Okay, so that's all for the explanation. So there is another sentence in section 15 that seems to make no sense. It's right here, the marked one. It says that each of the period of 20 years shall be taken to be a period ending within 2 years next before institution. Who cares what it says? What it basically means is that the period of limitation in these cases is that of 2 years. That is, if you want to file a suit for restoration of an easement right, you should file the suit within 2 years of the interruption to claim that you have acquired such easement right by prescription. Yeah, that's it. That's what this part says. I really don't understand why they can't use simple languages in legislation. Anyways, there's another thing in this section which says that in case the servient owner is the government, then the period of 20 years extends to 30 years before the dominant owner can claim absolute and enforceable easement right by means of prescription, because, it's the government. That's why. Okay, now moving on to section 16. Section 16 talks about exclusion in favor of a reversioner of a servient heritage. So firstly, who is a reversioner? A reversioner is a person in favor of whom an interest in a property is created, and after such interest is over, the property reverts back to the original owner, or in his absence to his legal heirs. So let's say X has a property, right? Now he creates a life interest in favor of Y on that property. So now Y can enjoy the property till his death, and after his death the property will revert back to X, or in his absence to his legal heirs. So in this particular example, Y is the reversioner and X is the grantor. Now, according to section 16, suppose in this particular example, the property of X is a subject of an easement right, whatever the easement may be. Now, X creates the life interest in favor of Y in that property. and after Y's death, because it's a life interest, the property will revert back to X. That's the provision of the interest. So according to section 16, the period for which that property remained with Y, that period, that will be excluded from the calculation of time period of continuous and uninterrupted usage of that particular easement right of which that property was the subject. So let's take an example, take an illustration. Let's say Z uses the property of X to get into his own property. That's an easement right of way. Now this right he uses for 10 years. Now after 10 years, X creates a life interest on that property in favor of Y, as we have seen in the example. Now let's say Y enjoyed the property for 10 years, 10 more years, and then he dies. And the property reverts back to X. Now after 1 year of such reversion, X interrupts the usage of his property as an easement right of way by Z. Cool? Now Z says, what's this bro? I have been using this property as my right of way for 21 years now. And so I have an absolute and enforceable right of way on this property and you cannot stop me. Well, he cannot say that, because this property was with Y for 10 years as a life interest, and according to section 16, that period will now be excluded. So effectively, Z has been using the easement right for 11 years, which is less than 20 years. And so he has still not developed an absolute and enforceable right of way, easement right of way over that property, and X can stop him in his usage of that property as a right of way. Clear? Now there are two essentials of this section. First essential is that the property must be enjoyed for at least 3 years by the person in favor of whom the interest was created. So for example, in our illustration, if Y dies after 1 year of the granting, or if the interest was granted for 2 years itself, then that period of 1 year or that period of 2 years will not be excluded from the calculation of 20 years. Because as the essential says, the enjoyment must be at least for a period of 3 years for the exclusion to take effect. The second essential is that after the reversion, the grantor, X in this case, he has to interrupt the usage of his land for easement within 1 year of such reversion. If he does not interrupt the usage of his land within 3 years of such reversion, and the total tenure of using that easement right, including during his time and the time when the property was with another person as an interest or life interest, whatever, if that period exceeds 20 years, then the dominant owner will have an absolute and enforceable right of easement over that property, and the grantor, the Servient owner, cannot prohibit him from using that particular easement at that point of time. So he has to stop him within 3 years, and the property must remain with the reversioner for at least 3 years. If these two are maintained, then the Servient owner can stop the dominant owner from using his property as an easement, even if the total period of using that easement has exceeded 20 years. Otherwise, he cannot. Okay, now the last section of acquisition of easement by prescription. Section 18. So section 18 basically provides us with some scenarios or some easements that can never be acquired by prescription, doesn't matter for how long they have been enjoyed continuously and uninterruptedly. At the end of this video, I will show you how many times I have exactly botched up the word uninterruptedly, including this one. Just watch that at the end. Anyways, so section 18 talks about that scenario. So very quickly, number one, if a particular easement right causes total destruction of the subject of the right, or can cause total destruction of the subject of the right, then that kind of easement can never be acquired through prescription. So do you remember the example of pollution of water body I gave earlier? So in that example, if the dominant owner, by polluting the water body of the Servient owner, destroys it completely or can destroy it completely, then that right cannot be acquired by easement of prescription. He can pollute the water body to a certain degree, but it should not cause total destruction of the water body, that is the subject of the right. If that happens, that right cannot be acquired by easement. Okay, easement right of free passage of light and air to an open ground can never be acquired by easement. Let's say these are two plots of land, right? Open land laying just like that for say 40 years, and of course the sunlight is falling on both of them. Now after 40 years, construction of a high rise starts in this particular land, and obviously that blocks the sunlight from getting into this land. Now the owner of this land cannot enforce his right of light and air and put an injunction on in this construction by saying that he has acquired such easement right by means of prescription. But he could have if he had a house in this particular land, and he could convince the court that somehow this high-rise construction of this high-rise over here somehow drastically impairs the enjoyment of this house. But in this case, because he just has a land, his plea will not be even heard in a court of law. Okay, now moving on, the next two are fairly similar. The right to use free-flowing water not flowing to a particular stream or collected in any place permanently, or the right to use underground water not flowing to a particular channel can never be acquired by means of easement by prescription. Fairly straightforward. Okay, now the last topic of acquisition of easement. After this we're done. So the last topic of acquisition of easement is easement acquired by custom. Section 18 talks about it. It's called customary easement. It's pretty simple. Just see this example. Suppose it is the custom of a particular village that all the cultivators of that village graze their cattle in a particular pasture, right? It is owned by someone, but every cultivator of that village grazes his or her cattle on that particular pasture. Now I buy a plot of land in that village and I start cultivating there. Now by means of custom, I will acquire the easement right to graze my cattle on that particular pasture. So I have acquired this easement right by means of a custom. This is customary easement. Okay, so that concludes this chapter of the Indian Easements Act that concerns about acquisition of easement. In the next video, we'll continue with section 19 and further. Till then guys, like this video if you like it. Subscribe to the channel if you find the channel as a whole interesting, and press the bell icon to receive further updates, more updates whenever I upload a video. So do whatever you like of the three of them, no pressures, and follow me on the various social media platforms. The links are below. And till then guys, remember that life is not fair. Get used to it. Bye. For more than 20 years, uninterruptedly